Hello everyone. As mentioned, I'm Shirin Ahlbäck Öberg and I work here at Uppsala University, so I feel actually quite at home, especially in this particular lecture hall where I normally lecture actually in political science. Anyhow, it is a great honor and pleasure to be assigned the task of moderating such a knowledgeable and experienced panel. And the panel members, they are already introduced, and there is also a bio where you can actually read more about each one of them. And I'm very happy to have you all here. This is how I plan to organize the discussion that we have ahead of us. I'm actually letting each of the panelists have an introduction for 5 minutes. A maximum, where they need to present their take on the subject of this panel. And the subject is, as you can see, Magna Charta and university integrity, yesterday, today, and in the future. And after their introductory talks, we will have a bit of a discussion between us up here in the front. And comment on each other's presentations and so on. But after a while, I will definitely invite the audience to ask questions as well. So the discussion will be opened up for you too, and I will announce that, of course. This is how I hope this will generate a good and interesting discussion after these really interesting keynote speeches and workshops today. The order of the presentation will be that you start, Sverker, and then Erin, and then Martina, and then Bengt. So please go ahead, Sverker.
Thank you very much. And I will try and say a few words about this topic. Now, first of all, I think it is quite important when we discuss issues of autonomy and integrity of universities to note, as was also hinted upon in the previous talk, that there is a swift change going on. And I would like to say that if you compare back to the 80s, maybe one key aspect of this is what we may want to call a de-Westernization or a globalization of the discourse, that we have are gradually taking on board the fact that this is certainly not something that is unique to a particular or a concern to a particular set of universities that made up the core, and you could also say the elite core. It is now happening in many ways in different parts of the world. So a diversification of this discourse, I think, is very important. Also, as I said in a session here in this very room a couple of hours ago, I think we need to be aware as we move forward with these pressing issues that sometimes, and I draw here on the type of conversation and public debate we've had in this country, but I know it exists in other countries too, is that we sometimes use a pretty idyllic or mythical version of some perceived autonomy that used to be the case in universities of the past. But if you really take a careful look at the university systems, how they have evolved and how the universities, even in this continent of Europe and in North America, have actually been organized, we do not always find empirically, so to speak, a full autonomy. These have been, in various ways, institutions that have been conditioned on society in many important ways, indeed in key ways. So, and when academics sometimes encounter society and moves around the political debates with a notion of academic freedom and integrity and authority that is perceived by the outside world as maybe dated or even sometimes thwarted, that is, I think, a disuse to the kind of discussion and the purposes we want to pursue. And this becomes increasingly pressing if we look at the diversity, the increasing diversity of academic institutions in their thousands around the world. So there's a certain sense of urgency, I think, to not just make demands on freedom, but also to, so to speak, educate ourselves. We have so many millions of workers in our fantastic institutions, and to really be updated on what our institutions are. In this belongs also, I think, a very important homework to be done about what kind of societal contribution we are making. Many interesting words have been said during these couple of days here about these matters, but let me just take my favorite example of this, which I take from the recently published 10-volume history of the University of Oslo, a major undertaking, a multi-year task of many historians and other researchers. And in one of those volumes, a social historian actually takes on the daunting task to explain and analyze the full impact. We are in the time of impact studies, aren't we? The full impact of this university in this country over 200 years. And I must say he succeeds completely and paradoxically, explaining how institutions like hospitals, schools, the radio, every single corner of Norwegian society being totally permeated by the skills and expertise and fantastic properties and qualities of the people who were trained in this university. Norway might be a special case. It's a small country. It was only the single university for quite some time, and you had it was certainly the leading university. But it is a narrative provided there. It is a convincing attempt to, if we may put it that way, sell this institution as a major societal factor. And I lack this kind of narratives in many countries and for many universities. I think we need to do that homework properly, and in order to enhance our role in societies, not only as providing the inputs for continued innovation and for economic growth and competitiveness, this kind of language that has been developed over 25 years, which is absolutely important and necessary, but isn't the only way to talk about our institutions. So I really welcome and urge us all to move in that direction in broadening our narratives and be proud of whatever we do for different parts of society. And there are exemplars to look at, just as in this particular Norwegian study, though available only in Norwegian still, I think.
Thank you very much. Then the word goes to you, Erin.
Thank you. Quite interesting. I actually am a student at the University of Oslo, so it's very interesting to hear about that, and I do want to read the volumes now as well. I think when I was given this task to talk about integrity and the Magna Charta, it was quite daunting. Integrity is a big word, as we could say. And it's something that may sweep over every student's head, and they feel that they don't have anything to contribute on this topic. Which was also at the time when I got this invitation, it was something that went through my head. Do I actually know what I'm talking about? But I think it is something... This microphone has some issues.
Yes.
I think it is something that students have a lot to contribute to. There is... a wide degree of arguments that students can make, and I think that when designing the Magna Charta, we also need to take into account that students need to be involved in these discussions on integrity. So, society's benefit. Is it possible to change?
Is it possible to
maybe
close the other ones? Okay.
Yeah. Society's benefit, I think it's a phrase that can be defined in many different ways. The way that, as a student, as a member of the European Students' Union, what I would say is that it means that the university and higher education is a public good. That is our definition, at least. And I think it's important that as a public good or as a benefit for society, for all of society, this needs to be considered for the foundation of all activities taking place within the university. This involves creating a democratic institution, which means setting the example for society for what democracy should be. It should involve including all of society. Naturally, as a public good, it should be accessible and inclusive of all people. Maintaining integrity involves including students as a natural part of the academic community. It involves seeing students as co-producers of knowledge, and as such, a part of all of the decision-making processes that are taking place, both on a formal and informal level. This was also covered by the session that Fredrik, Jens, and I had on the student Magna Charta. We had a session where we discussed issues of academic freedom for students, such as plagiarism of students' work, denying students the intellectual property rights for their work, and in general, the discussions of how to maintain autonomy within student organizations and for student representatives. I think the key here is maintaining respect. Respect for students as co-producers, as a part of the academic community. They are the future of the university. We will be doing the research in the future. And we are also the members of society that will be taking decisions and also involved in the workplace and in all parts of society in the future. And I think one of the main conclusions that we had out of that session was that we need to also take this interpretation and apply it to the Magna Charta. That when we refer to the academic community, we are also referring to students. Today we also discussed quite a few threats that are being placed on academic freedom. There are many challenges and pressures placed on university, but how is this affecting students and their learning? And how is this affecting the mutual learning process between academics and students? What are the values of a university education? Universities are facing financial pressures and demands from politicians and businesses alike. And we did hear this within the last presentation, and I think there were a lot of valuable points made. Amongst the rhetoric of employability and transversal skills, we must remember that education, higher education, is a public good for all. We need to provide an education that can, quote-unquote, stand the test of time and prepare students for a process of learning throughout the rest of their lives, or the phrase lifelong learning. Instead of merely responding to the short-term demands, this is what will prepare us for the long term. And lastly, integrity also involves seeing students as an equal part of the academic community, which cannot happen when students are only seen as customers or consumers of education. There is a different kind of interaction taking place, and it's no longer a mutual learning process that is taking place within the classroom. And I think one of the main points that I got out of the last presentation that also relates to this is that what people are willing to pay for is not necessarily what is society's benefit. But anyway, these were some perspectives based on today's discussion, and also some input from the students on what we define as integrity and where to go from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erin. Then I will pass the word to you, Martina. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. When talking about university integrity, I feel uncomfortable starting the discussion without shedding a bit more light on what do we mean when how to define it. Today I heard people talking about university integrity meaning integrity of the university leadership, integrity of academic staff. When we consider students as full members of the academic community, then we also talk about their integrity. And then the question is, how do these different elements actually combine to be university integrity? How do we maintain it and protect it, and what is the resulting outcome of these different dynamics? Because I don't think we are always very precise in whose integrity we are talking about. I would also like to try to unpack the concept of integrity, and I was actually inspired by the words written in Swedish above the entrance to the main hall of this building. If I got the translation right from the locals, it's doing things freely is big, but doing things right, it's even bigger. Okay, that's good enough. Because if the topic of integrity or the issue of integrity is, from my point of view, about doing the right things in the right way, and then of course you have to ask yourself who is actually defining what the right things are and what the right way is. Brings me back to whose integrity we are talking about, but it also brings forward how is the concept of integrity related to the issues of academic freedom and institutional autonomy that the Magna Charta talks about. And I would argue that integrity is not just about enjoying the academic freedom and institutional autonomy, and when I say academic freedom, I also mean the academic freedom of students, but it's also about living up to these standards and using them. I want to avoid the concept of accountability, because I think when we talk about, for example, autonomy being related to the issue of accountability, we are in a way saying that universities should be held accountable, which then could also mean that someone else is holding the university accountable. So in a way, the university has a passive role there. But I would like to argue that if we are talking about integrity, the university should have a much more active role in actually living up to these principles. And there also is the distinction between what could be labeled as a formal autonomy. So what does the legislation, regulation say, how much freedom the institution or the individual academic staff have to decide how they're going about what they are doing, as opposed to what some of my former colleagues from the University of Oslo, it seems that we have an Oslo kind of panel here, call living autonomy. So when the universities are, when we have these formal changes where universities are supposedly given more autonomy, there are two things to be to have in mind. One is that with formal changes in legislation and regulation, there might be also changes that actually impose more control on the universities that are not necessarily visible at the first glance. I'm, for example, referring to various quality assurance and accreditation standards. But also that the universities might not be all of them fully ready to embrace that autonomy, because then that also means that there is a responsibility for decisions that are made. So in a way, and these discussions are always have partly a universal principles side to them, but also they have to be contextualized in a specific situation. And then finally, I'd like to say that we were discussing what might be conditions for integrity, and very often, both yesterday and today, the issue of let's say, supportive economic situation was put forward, that the lack of or decreasing funding of higher education, public funding of higher education, is putting actually the academic integrity at risk. And while this is true, I would like to say that putting too much focus on the money side is in some ways an easy way out, because there have been also occasions where the academic community did not actually live up to its own principles and let some norms and values slide. So that basically saying it's just the problem with the money is kind of putting things in a too simple way. So while both the supportive economic situation and really being socialized and maintaining norms or values are, we could argue, necessary conditions for integrity, neither of them are sufficient. So we should not focus only on one, but we should always take them into account together.
Thank you very much, Martina. Then the word is yours, Bengt.
Thank you. Let me just take up a few points here during this interesting meeting. The first one is a question asked by Hans Rosling, which I think we have to consider carefully. And the question was, why don't we teach this? And as I understood it from the results of his polls, one reason was we didn't know it. We were misinformed. If so, could we make it better? Could we teach ourselves more? After all, if you think of your profession as an academic teacher, you have a quite narrow speciality where you really consider yourself an expert. But in order to teach that area, you need an environment of knowledge. And if this knowledge is the knowledge you got at high school, or at best at the early university some many years ago, you aren't competent even for teaching the speciality. Because all of us agree that a speciality and facts taught there, like the structure of the universe, which is one of my areas, requires a context consisting of lots of ingredients which are a bit outside the core of my teaching. So we have to, since knowledge is increasing so much and so rapidly, we have to keep teaching ourselves also in a broader context than just as regards our speciality, in order to stay competent as student advisors and teachers. By the way, Hans Rosling also mentioned this course where he made the debut as a teacher of this sort, namely the course here in this room some 20 years ago on man and nature. And that course was initiated by students. The students forced us to broaden our perspective. And that's, I think, a good thing for students to try to do. Then I'll comment on values and market. So we have our academic values, and they meet market values and market considerations more than before. I have studied this during last year in a study of boasting in science, where I explored in a great number of applications for positions at this university how people boasted, or if you want, lied. And after some care, I found that on the order of 1/3 of all the applications for junior faculty positions contained clear exaggerations, and I would call them lies. Words like world leading, for instance, were used very frequently. It's even worse, because it turns out when I did the same experiment, as Siebold was mentioning here, I went to web pages of Swedish universities. I found the same kind of phenomenon as you did. It's kind of almost amusing or entertaining to see how much of exaggeration there is, but it turned out to be different in different areas. So, right as you pointed out, the more commercially directed activities like those of Handelshögskolan in Stockholm and others had the record. On my scale, those had a boasting factor of 22. The two leading ones were small new universities like Halmstad and Blekinge, while the old ones like Uppsala were quite down on the scale, a typical factor of 5. Okay? The least boasting one of all these was the only one which is high up on international ranking scales, namely Karolinska Institute. And you can say, they don't have to boast. No. But the others, they feel they have to, because they feel they are in a market, and they are in a market, fighting for local money from local cities, etc., but in particular perhaps from local industry. And so the culture of honesty is at danger. And you can note this if you read applications. For instance, how many Swedish applicants for these kind of positions don't say that they are passionate teachers? That's a phrase which is common. Where did they learn it, and who learned it? Who taught them to do so? So I would, to make a tough statement, I would say we are teaching our students to be dishonest. And we do this in a culture which celebrates honesty more than, I think, any other culture. Can we go on like this? So we have to take these conflicts seriously between the values we are pushed into and the values we try to entertain. I should also say that we had an interesting debate then in one of these workshops on this kind of problem, whether ethical code, like the guidelines of the IEU and the Magna Charta Observatory, which I think are quite useful, but whether they really get the point, because after all, maybe the values we want to keep are driven by or pushed by the new context in which universities are. But if so, of course, guidelines of this sort could be quite useful in order to at least mobilize consciousness and some resistance from our quarters. Talking about this situation in the context we live, we also have, and Siebold was mentioning that, we are living under a metric agenda, so to speak, where everything is measured, and not the least so-called quality. And this is something which worries me a lot, that we count number of publications, and we count, that's productivity, and we count popularity, citation indices, and we judge value judgments on that. And what worries me most is not so much that we use that sometimes because we think we can balance it against other factors perhaps. But the problem is that we also give tools to other people who are not very insightful or not in the area, not competent to judge quality. And we give them excellent tools to do the work for you. And as I see it, this is really threatening the integrity of the universities, that we hand out tools to other authorities, including politicians, to judge so-called quality. Then a last comment I would like to make is that I found Siebold's stressing here of the importance of discussing dilemmas and mistakes, a very important one. And here I can imagine that the Observatory could contribute, and other international organizations, because these questions are not only very national or very, very contextual. There are some general problems one could discuss, and it's interesting to see they illuminated in various issues. I think in very general terms, ethics, in a broad sense, is best taught by examples. So I really would like to encourage us to collect our best examples of dilemmas and mistakes that we have made.
Thank you very much to the whole panel. You have brought up so many interesting things, and I will start out by trying to address a few of the things of your statements, and the whole panel is, of course, welcome to comment, if you wish. I would like to start out with something that you said, Sverker, and about the mythological understanding of university autonomy or academic freedom. Something that I've been wondering about is, isn't it better to have a mythological understanding than to have no understanding at all? Because many of my, I would say, colleagues and so on, I mean, a problem that we see is that the individualization of the research identity, so to speak, we talk about research hotels. I mean, the university as an idea is a little bit eroding. So that is actually a question. Is it better to have this mythological understanding?
I think it's good to, here it is. I think it's good to have ideals. And of course, ideals are not the same as reality. In that sense, I agree, we can be slightly mythological. And I think it's very good to argue the case for, if you really want to do that, and I do that to some extent, really want to argue the case for the classical university autonomy, Humboldtian style, so to speak. But having also been working in some relation to policy advice and to politics, I realize that it may be, there's an ivory tower risk here, that we, so to speak, move away from the society we wish to serve. We must strike the balance. And that is why I think it is quite important to also look at the realities and see that universities have always been in a very strong, deep-seated relationships to the rest of society. And it keeps evolving, and the issues and the agendas change. We are now talking about the Anthropocene, sustainability, resilience, making the relationships with the planets work. And universities are crucial in that work. And that means that we cannot make the case that we should ask for privacy and then have them come back in 10 years. We need constant interchange. And I think sometimes that is when the mythological version of academic autonomy becomes a little bit problematic, then that we should stay too much aside. So I'm arguing really for us to strike the balance. And I would add to that also that I really would emphasize pedagogy here, learning about our own institutions, learning about, for example, if we are dishonest, well, that should be brought out into the light. We need to study ourselves. We are not victims of the ranking and league tables that others put together. We are on top of things, and we shall remain on top of things. And that means we should engage with this and question it, bring it out to the public domain, do what we really can do better than everybody else, namely study things and bring out the truth and demonstrate it. That's how we want to encounter these things. And so, and what does that mean in reality? It means, for example, not to jump on to any ready-made solution of academic integrity and say, this is what we want, because it isn't one size fits all here. It differs between Venezuela and Egypt, as we heard. It differs between regional colleges and the top research universities, engineering colleges. We have such a diversity, and it needs to be articulated and brought to the fore in every single one of these institutions. And that is long time, hard work to do, and it requires also wrestling with the myths and find out what is mythological. In that respect, of course, as an historian, it's an easy thing for me to say that, well, it's very important to have history here, but it's also a matter of the anthropology and sociology of our institutions to understand who we are, and we don't always do that. Not everybody does, and it needs to be a continued discussion. That's what I mean with the importance of demythicizing ourselves.
Interesting. Within my own domain of the humanities and social sciences, we have been actually talking about having it as a first lecture on the PhD program. What is the university? What kind of institution is it? Many of you actually touched upon issues that has to do with our norms and values. So I wanted to pose a question about that too. I found it very interesting when you, for instance, Martina, said something about, well, you know, we cannot only blame it on the money. It is about living the values. And also, you were talking about dishonesty, Bengt, how that is actually, you know, transmitted within the system in an unsound way. And also, from a student perspective, you were really emphasizing how that we need to transform our norms and values to you. You are the, you know, upcoming researchers and so on. So if I start there, could you elaborate a bit, Martina, on this? When you say that, well, you know, if you look at institutions, they're not necessarily living, you know, the values. Are you addressing the academic community or the management or both?
Well, I do have maybe the most correct answer here is both, but I want to clarify that, because I think we are too often, and it kind of actually slipped, I think, for all of us when we were talking about the academic community or when we are talking about the university, it's defining the university in opposition as distinct from society and so on. And For example, Bengt had said you have made a distinction between values we are pushed into and values we want to entertain. And I actually have a problem with putting things in that way, because the university as an institution and the academic community is not a pushover community. So people who are part of the academic community are also voters, are also sometimes politicians, are citizens, comment on day-to-day political events. So when we say that, okay, there has been a surge of market values and we are forced to compete, well, the academic community is also both creating the rules of the game as well as playing that game. So I think it's a bit difficult to say, well, you know, we are doing our best. It's the others who are bad guys and are forcing us to play the game. And then when we slip and are actually dishonest, well, then, you know, it's not really our fault entirely. We were made to do so. I mean, I'm deliberately now putting things in this way, because I have seen the academic community actually failing to uphold its values, I think, one too many times. Not reacting to situations of plagiarism, not claiming that they are supposed to have academic freedom and autonomy, but not necessarily supporting similar kinds of values for the rest of the society, saying that some of these rules apply only to one part of the community but not to all, and so on. So that's what I meant. I think it's not just the managers who are here the bad guys, even though sometimes it's very easy to say, yeah, you know, we as the staff, we are doing fine. It's the leadership that's not doing their job, or it's a conspiracy. It's the administrators or the technical staff that's not that's pushing us and so on. So I think that's. I'm not saying that there is no truth in the tensions within the academic community or within the universities, but I think we sometimes paint a too simple picture in order to kind of have an alibi. Sometimes for the fact that the academic community is not always guarding its own principles, but often using it when it's useful for us.
Okay, would you like to comment on that, Bengt?
Yes, on your question also. I think when it comes to values, another virtue here is the willingness to listen. And that's quite an important virtue in the scientific community. So I think we at least have to listen to the others who talk about other things, other values, including politicians and people from other parts of the society. And then I think Sverker may correct me, but my impression is that the universities as organizations are very pragmatic. They have used to be that, and they are that. So, I mean, there's not, I think, a fundamental risk that we keeping our values so strongly that we die. Okay? But thirdly, and that's a simple general advice, of course, one has to take one fights. Not all fights, but there are certain fights that are important, and they can well be value-centered, I suppose.
Okay. Thank you. I have a question to follow up on your introduction to Erin and about reminding us or everyone about that the students are also a part of the academic community, which seems to be a very valid point. However, my question to you is, what is challenging this idea, do you think? I mean, from your perspective, is it the faculty or is it other forces? Do you have any thoughts on what is challenging it and what could be done?
What is challenging it? Just give me a minute.
You were mentioning a little bit. You were talking about the idea of university being a public good. So one challenge could be the commodification, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, commodification and tuition fees is always something that we bring up, and it is something that impacts students and the relationship between teachers very directly. I also think it's a matter, I mean, it's, as Martina says, it's really easy to place the blame on funding and where the money is. But I think it's also a matter of changing the attitudes of teachers. We have new pedagogical new ways of teaching. We have new pedagogical methods, and we need to take those into use. I think another issue that comes up a lot is forgetting the entire mission of teaching in addition to the mission of research. Research has a lot of prestige in it, it's quantifiable, we can get clear results out of how many citations we get, but where is the prestige in teaching? And that is something that tends to be forgotten because it isn't easy to quantify. So I think it comes from too much of a focus on the quantifiable matters. It comes from the issues of commodification where students are seen as customers, but it also comes from just a general lack of having communication between academics as to how to teach and how to disseminate what they're researching. Thank you.
Well, as you know, the panel is about university integrity, but the whole conference is also about society's benefit. And this is a question to the panel. What the understanding of society's benefit, what does that really contain? And has it changed over time? Does it mean, or should it mean different things in different contexts? I'm asking the question because I listened to this really interesting historical lecture yesterday in the afternoon, and where it was obvious that the usefulness of the university was an issue already in the 18th century. It seems like an eternal question. So, how can we sort out what society's benefit? Some of it has been touched upon today, but isn't that a tricky one? Who decides what is society's benefit? Bengt.
I think there is at least one aspect which I think is quite important for me being an astronomer, and that is, if you look around at politics today, for instance, in our country, you see that the short-term perspectives are at focus. It's hard to survive next election if you don't concentrate on today's problems. Today, Hans Rosling mentioned that he found more of long-term perspectives among industrial leaders than he found in the academic world. At least he hinted at that. I think if he's right, that's a shame. I think if anybody can apply long-term perspectives on the situation for humans on Earth, that's we. And we should really spend time in thinking and researching and teaching about the long-term perspectives.
Erin?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with how the information that is developed and researched within the university impacts society as far as how we disseminate it. What kind, like I said in the last question, what kind of pedagogical methods are we using to disseminate this information that we are researching? And I think this is an interesting part. I think the combination, or within the Magna Charta, combining research and teaching is so essential here, that our teachers are also researchers, that our researchers are teaching, and that there is a combination of research and teaching within the curriculum, within the classroom, and within the laboratories as well. I think that being able to involve students and involve the community more will make a broader, will make it so that the decision makers are also informed of what is going on within the institution, so that it's not this question of whether or not the institution is relevant, but what is it that the institution is providing us with is a benefit for all of us.
Thank you. Sverker?
Yes, it is a very long debate and discussion about what is useful, and we shouldn't delve into that history. But I would like to pick up also on what Hans Rosling said this morning. I was intrigued, as I suppose everybody else, but I was also slightly wondering about a few things. And I was asking myself, is it really that bad? Do our students in various programs and courses really get that kind of miseducation. And I think from what I know, at least, it isn't fully as bad, actually. I happen to know a few historical demographers, and I happen to know a little bit about what they teach. It is perfectly obvious that their students learn everything that we heard today and a lot more. That does not need to say precisely that they can answer every single of the questions, so choosing between different levels of percentage, as we heard. But I think still that some important things could be said. We should also go back to Paul Ehrlich in the 60s. He was an academic. He was at Stanford University, still is, I think. And that was an important contribution of the time. It's actually a very good illustration, this morning's talk, of something that we pride ourselves on, to actually see knowledge move forward. To stand on the shoulders of giants. Well, not everybody's a giant, but we move forward because we learn more and we disseminate this. I think it was more an illustration of the learning process that we are so good at than really a denouncement of what was going on. I saw a little bit of exaggeration there, but maybe to make the point. And I would like to go from this to something that I also heard today that I think was extremely important. It was about, we heard about the universities in the Middle East and how many primarily American universities established themselves there in a boutique fashion. You open up kind of a mall of schools, Cornell, Georgetown, and so on, and then you can pick and choose. What do they offer in these malls? They offer a very narrow bandwidth of knowledge, the kind of commodifiable knowledge that you were talking about. And having made that observation, I think we should go back to the question of usefulness. There is a usefulness in our university systems that is to do with a broad integrated perspective. We also have courses in heritage studies, in the things to deal with the past that nobody's really prepared to pay for, that sometimes taxpayers have to pay for through the public budget. The knowledge that we need for this is also disseminated and taken care of by somebody. There is an invisible collective usefulness in so much knowledge that cannot fit the boutique system. That is the public good. And if nobody else will take care of this, so I think we need to nuance the discussion of usefulness. There would also be in some industry department of the government somebody rushing in with his portfolio and ask for numbers about how the economy will develop and what is useful, and have to propose this to take the strategic decisions based on these numbers. But I'd say we need to argue the complex case. We need to argue that things really hang together. We are a cornerstone institution in that phenomenon that we call society. And society has no single number.
Thank you. Martina?
I'll actually follow up on this, because while I agree that there is this broad societal benefit, I think sometimes knowledge and how we go about knowledge in universities is actually quite fragmented. We have our departments, our research groups. Sometimes there is actually an English-based scholar who wrote a book about academic tribes and territories. And you see this kind of tribal behavior in universities. And then I would like to ask the question, if we agree that the universities should be part of the answer of what is actually society's benefit. I don't think that it's just up to the university to decide that. And that we should take into account both short-term and long-term. If we focus only on the long-term, we will not really be successful. But at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, is the way how we go about things internally, how we go about both teaching and research, actually conducive to answering these big questions? Because our knowledge is very specialized and very fragmented. Sometimes these tribes don't want to talk to each other as much as they should, because saying that anthropologists are very different from ethnologists is about also disciplinary identity. So you have to maintain that you have a legitimate right for a certain turf. or my favorite discussion, whether it's the economists or sociologists and political scientists who should have a main say, again a conspiracy, a main say about the society. So I do agree that we should take that the universities are supposed to take that role. I'm just saying that we need to be a bit more critical about how we are actually going about this role, that we are fragmenting things a bit too much, and then saying, well, you know, the public is not listening to us, but maybe we are not talking clearly enough.
Okay. Thank you. It's now about high time to bring in the audience to ask or comment on what the panel has been discussing. And there will be a microphone passed around. So if there is... We have this gentleman over there. Over there. And please present yourself, introduce yourself and...
It's Mahoba from South Africa. I'm from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. If when I come out of the door here, a journalist asks me, you've been discussing university integrity, and says to me, does the institution have integrity as a university? How should I answer an analyst? Do we have integrity rather than just talk about it as if we can't assess ourselves whether we have it or not? Because that would be maybe the basis for me. The second question that is related to this relates to two major events in the world. I think in 2009, the world faced a financial crisis, and this was created by graduates of universities. What was the position of the university in terms of integrity of their own graduates, who created this financial crisis that has caused so much human suffering, and the consequences of which are that poor people have to pay for the consequences of university graduates? A closely related issue is during the Iraq War, where was the university in commenting on the pros or the cons of the Iraq War? As an institution, did we ever see anything? There's no right or wrong answer. It's just a provocative debate, and I would welcome any ideas.
Okay, there are 3 questions. Does anyone in the panel feel... They're not easy questions. Sverker, please.
I can at least say, I can say, make you confident on the Iraq War. Many academics around the world protesting. In this country, they took to the streets, and at MIT there was Noam Chomsky. So you can. It's a big debate, and in some countries they were, like the UK, people, even academics, were more angry than in other ones. I think this whole discussion about the moral and political responsibility for things like the financial crisis is very interesting, but I probably hold them conventional opinions about this. But I think the question might be even more interesting if you ask it this way. Almost every big issue is treated by people who have some kind of power, and those are universally almost trained in universities, and they take on an everyday basis tons of good decisions that we all benefit from. Some things go badly wrong. They could be militarily, industrially, they could be financially, politically. And it's a hard time attributing the sin and have some punishment made on those who take wrong decisions. We need to constantly improve. And one area, I think, since 2008, the financial crisis, where I think there is a lot of room for improvement and lots of work going on right now is the financial sector and economics and bank regulation and all of that.
Thank you, Sverker. Martina.
I'd like to comment on the economic crisis and whether universities are responsible because these were graduates of the universities. Well, first of all, they are not just that, But secondly, what's interesting for me is actually what the aftermath of the crisis might be doing to how the economics as a discipline is organized and what is taught at some of the universities in Europe, as far as I know, maybe also in the US. About that I'm not entirely sure. There is a movement by the students of economics that require more diversity in what kind of economic theories are being taught, because they would argue what has been taught so far, the economic crisis is proof that things actually do not work that way. And the other thing that I think is actually very good and relates to academic integrity is exposing some of the maybe not so very solid economic research that's used then by policymakers to introduce, for example, austerity measures. There was this case where one of the papers, now I forgot the authors, both last names start with an R, that's been used by policymakers as proof that austerity measures are supposed to work. And then an MIT graduate basically said, well, you know, they have been kind of doing strange stuff with their data, so maybe their conclusions are not as solid. So I think that this kind of feeding back into the discussions about the discipline, when these big events feed back into the discussions about the disciplines, is actually very useful. And I think that's also the strength of the university, that it welcomes, not always and not perhaps to a sufficient extent, but it welcomes these discussions, and these discussions are possible.
Okay, thank you. Erin, you wanted to comment as well?
Yeah, what I wanted to touch upon was also the financial crisis, because I think it kind of points exactly why integrity for students is so important, that exposing them to discussions on integrity and ethics in their own field is essential. And also including them in research projects so that they are faced with these dilemmas of what is right and what is wrong, what is integrity in my field. Because you do have all of these examples. You have Einstein and the atomic bomb, for example. You have examples where research can be misused, and it's the researcher themselves or the student themselves that is going and using this information, and they need to have the ethical background and have these discussions in the back of their minds to be able to make the right choices then and there. So I think involving students as early as possible in these discussions is what needs to be done when it comes to those kinds of issues.
Thank you. Bengt, could you please pass that?
To take another example, which I know more of, we had this earthquake in Aquila in Italy a few years ago, and there was a group of geoscientists who had commented on the precursors to this and said there's no danger at all, and people stayed at home, and then several people were killed and hurt as a result. If you look at that case, I think it's rather clear that those colleagues of ours, those scientists, they were not very careful in phrasing the risks. And you could learn from this, and that's my point. One should learn from such examples that if you address the public on advice, or politicians on advice, you had better be as careful or even more careful than you are in your normal scientific work, also in claiming uncertainties. That's part of the profession, and you shouldn't oversimplify such things. After all, your colleague scientists, when reading your papers, they can judge even without your precautions, but the public or other people, laymen, can't. So a higher standard in advising on serious matters is important. And that's an example of learning, which I think now takes place in that community.
Thank you. Next question is Cynthia Sörlin from Queen's University in Canada.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to be a part of this conference and to have an opportunity to think and talk about integrity in a whole variety of different contexts. And of course, it's a compunction for all of us now to go back to our own institutions and to try and inculcate a culture of integrity. But we've heard today that that's a really difficult thing to do. People don't read guidelines and regulations until they're in really big trouble. They don't want to be preached at. But one of the things they love to do is read about mistakes and dilemmas, as our colleague was saying here. And when I'm not being a university administrator, I'm actually a professor of psychology. And in the process of becoming licensed as a psychologist, and maybe others of you have had this experience as well, you deal with a whole series of case studies. So you have your regulations there, but you also have case studies, most of them involving big mistakes made by other psychologists or professionals in that situation. And I wonder if we as a community should think about putting together a series of case studies that reflect mistakes and dilemmas, of course, stripped of identifying information, but as a way of stimulating conversations on our campuses about these sorts of issues. The risk, when such case studies become available to people in general, to the public and to the politicians, we will have laid bare our souls.
Thank you. Next question is to the gentleman over there. I'm collecting a few questions now.
Thank you very much. Jarosław Płóciennik, Vice Rector of the University of Łódź in Poland. And I would like to express my great pleasure to hear all the speeches about values and especially virtues, especially by the President Nordal. And here at this panel, a lot of already said about values and long-term perspective. Bengt Gustafsson said about long-term perspective. And I would like to say that we are in a tension between two needs of the society. One is expressed by students who want jobs, and they want jobs now, in 3 years. But the main point is that nobody knows what kind of jobs will be in need in 5 years. The market of jobs is very, very changing and demanding and very dynamic, so to speak. So the main problem is that if we stick to the integrity in a long-term perspective, we stick to the key skills or to the virtues, as you can say, or in a European qualification framework, this is social skills, like creative thinking, like teamwork, ability to teamwork, and also criticism, a kind of criticism which could be provided by research, and so on, so on. So if we stick with these values, which are connected with, I don't know, liberal education perhaps, we could win the demand for jobs in the future, because nobody knows what kind of jobs will be in the 5, 6, 10 years. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone in the panel want to comment on the two last? Yes, please go ahead, Erin.
Let's see. I can respond directly to that. We actually, in Astro, we just completed a project that was called SAGE, Student Advancement of Graduate Employability. And that was in a direct response to the growing usage of the term employability and the students' demands of, yes, we want jobs now. And we do want jobs now. There's no doubt about that. We are going to be the ones that go out into the workforce tomorrow and need to have jobs. But we also need to be able to have a job in 50 years. We also need to have those skills, or maybe not 50, 40, okay. We need to be able to have the skills that are not skills as such as repairing a certain machine, but rather knowing how to learn to repair a machine that is in 40 years. And this is why one of the concepts that we talk a lot about here is student-centered learning. It's learning to learn. that students need to be equipped with this ability to switch their position within the course of their lives. Instead of having a curriculum that is directly related to a specific job. That is what is necessary to meet tomorrow's challenges, is what we say. Yeah.
Thank you, Erin. Oh, now I have 3 more people who have asked, who wants to ask questions, and I think I will draw the line there, so we will make it in time, but I think we'll take them in a row now. And it's first Professor Alexabielis up front here.
Thank you. I'm Alexabielis from the University of Zagreb and a member of the Council. The question goes in the same direction like those before. I mean, from this trend of accountability, which was a kind of arithmetic accountability, which is quantitative, we are now coming to the new concept that this is integrity. Integrity is very probably going deeply into moral and ethics of us as a collective. This is a kind of purification. The first question, which is along those same lines, is what does it mean in our real life in universities in the next few years? What kind of procedures, what kind of our involvements will be present when we speak about integrity, and what is the purpose, what is the final aim? For me, the final aim is that perhaps there is a kind of unconscious perhaps, feeling that the societies are in the deep problem, and then the academy has to think in the new ways. The typical problem is unemployability of youth. Mm-hmm. I mean, the deep question for me is the first, if this will pertain as a deep problem, whether university will be necessary as an institution. Because finally the question is, listening this first speak this morning, 7 billion people, half of them being active, who will find job for them? Perhaps there is no need for job at all in the civilization. So these are the deep questions I think are behind our attempts to go back into something which was before, I would say, taken for granted. Integrity of university was taken for granted. This is so. We should be integrity. Mm-hmm. So the question is why we enter deeply into this question at all.
Thank you. And we'll have to wait for the answer. I think someone from the Swedish University of Agriculture Sciences, or the man up. Yes, you. It's your turn.
Thank you. Per Sandin from the Swedish University of the Agricultural Sciences. This is not a question but a comment on the suggestion of using case studies or compiling case studies. I and several of my colleagues do quite a lot of teaching of research ethics to PhD students and staff. We use that kind of case studies all the time. They are very helpful, but they are also available. There are loads of them on the internet. This university hosts a website called codex.uu.se, where there are plenty of such case studies available. So the problem is not, I think, the availability of case studies, but how to create opportunities for people to actually discuss those case studies. And that's a pressing issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last one on my list is a lady here in the front.
Thank you. Barbara Klein, Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study here in Uppsala. Please forgive me for bringing up the issue I want to bring up, but I can't help but thinking of Sweden's third largest party that just emerged a few days ago. And I mean, lots of scholarship has been written about how to converse about various parties with various kinds of fascist backgrounds. Nevertheless, we as in a scholarly community are just as flabbergasted as many of our colleagues in other sectors of the Swedish society and elsewhere. how do we mobilize our values, our virtues as community of scholars in these kinds of cases? Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Now I'm actually giving the word to each one of you in the panel, and you may comment on what's been asked or commented here. And you may also, if you are quick, add a final thing. Bengt, you can start. There is another microphone.
Hello? Yes. I just wanted to take the last challenge here. I think we as scholars and scientists at all, or so many universities, there's one thing we know from experience, at least, and that's the significance of a tight, I would say, an intensive international collaboration. We are doing much better science as a result of collaboration, and we must welcome our colleagues from all the world to take part in this endeavor. And we have to teach the public that this is such a fundamental thing in our efforts, that it's worth taking the fight against people who want to keep those foreigners away.
Thank you, Martina.
I'd like to take up this: will universities be necessary as an institution in the future? Universities are remarkably resilient creatures. They have survived more than 900 years of significantly changing circumstances and what the society considers useful, and have been able to adapt. I mean, from a point of view of one lifetime, it may seem that universities are changing perhaps too slowly or not changing at all, partly because we do still have some rituals that can be traced back then, but I don't think, and I don't believe anyone who claims, well, you know, we will have no universities in 15, 20, 100 years' time. They might look a bit different, but I actually doubt that they will look very, very different than they do today. That doesn't mean that we should not question whether we are doing the right things the right way, but I'm not really worried about the future of the universities.
Thank you. Sverker, please go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of comments. First, about the question you asked about procedures to move forward. I think that is the toughest question, really. I can only say what I said before, that I think we need to go back home and try to think about this and implement it also in our own strategies. There is a risk always of lofty rhetoric when these kinds of things are discussed. But I think it is always to be implemented in the day-to-day work. That's when the challenges are. That's where the devil's details also are. Then we meet every 2 years or so to discuss it on the lofty level also. That's needed. Then I would like to say that about the case studies, I was reminded by your comment from Canada back there that about Peter Hall's great book, 20 Great Planning Disasters, for example. And there is a certain literature of almost apocalyptic about what can go wrong. And maybe this is a very good idea to revisit these kinds of things. But then finally about Barbro Klein's challenge, I think it's extremely important that we face these challenges sometimes. First of all, we cannot expect that we all agree about everything. We heard in a lecture here earlier today about, for example, this University of Illinois case where the de-hiring process of an intellectual had tweeted about the Gaza war. And of course, certain forces don't like that. And within the university community, these same forces also exist. So we must sometimes be divided. But what I would plead for, and what I think we should always do, those that can be mobilized internationally, as Bengt just suggested, is to make the case. There is one thing we can do also better than most people. We can make the case. We can get the expertise together. We can assemble around. We can carefully go through, present the literature, state of knowledge, and we can demonstrate what is the best thing to do, or at least present what is known current knowledge. And in some cases, that, you may say, simple thing can be enormously important to make the case and make it forcefully. We do that perhaps in the public domain too rarely, because we are also the tribes and territories that you just talked about. But sometimes we need to move together, and I think we have the capacity to do that.
Thank you. Erin, please go ahead.
Yeah, I first a comment to the case studies discussion. I think what is really important here is to not be scared. We can't fear the truth coming out of the institution. And also, like I said before, we have to expose students to these dilemmas. And if those dilemmas are not made public, to the society as a whole, we have an issue with transparency there, and students may get the wrong image even just with that being withheld. As far as the issue of the recent Swedish elections, coming from Norway, I share the same kind of fear, hesitation as having one of the populist right parties in government, or the far right, at least you could say. And I think one of the ways, I think we should avoid trying to distinguish us and them. I think that will only make things worse if we say that those people are this way. We will separate them even more. What needs to be done here is, again, looking at access and outreach. These are often populations that maybe don't have a higher education background. Why do they not have a higher education background? That is what needs to be the question here. How can we disseminate the information that we have that makes us think differently into the broader public, so that it's accessible also for those populations that don't have any higher education background? So I think having access strategies, I talked about this under dinner yesterday, actually, community outreach, where where children are exposed to the university at a very, very young age, whether they come from a farming background, an industrial working class family, or an upper middle class academic family. I think it's about exposing people at such a young age as possible, and I think we can get far with that.
Thank you very much. Time flies when you're having fun. Now our time has come to an end, and I really want to thank the panel. I don't believe in the Audit Society, but according to my performance indicators, you made a 10 out of 10. And I think we should give them an applause.